assistant professor of Italian at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Sorry about that. He is a graduate of Middlebury. He also has a laurea from the University of Florence, and he completed his PhD at Harvard University in 2003. Sorry about that, I need my glasses. 2008. I could see those little circles, but excuse me. I've heard Professor McManaman speak a couple of times in different conferences, and I've always been impressed by the clarity of his method, of his thinking, and of his expression. So I think you can look forward to a very good evening tonight. Professor McManaman is the author of a number of articles, and a book is forthcoming. In 2001, he published Un anno nel canzoniere. He's a scholar of Petrarch and Dante quite clearly. He published Un anno nel canzoniere in studi italiani, testimonianze di un'anima divisa in studi di filologia italiana, l'incontro edenico con Beatrice e io sento sì d'amor la gran pusanza in Dante Studies. Everything's in Italian?
No, the last one isn't.
Yeah. And in just recently, Philosophical Progression, Causality, and the Principles of Dante's Commedia in Viator. This is an abbreviated list. His book is forthcoming, and we're looking forward to this evening, Jimmy.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I would like to thank Professor Laurie Shepard for kindly inviting me here this evening, and I thank Boston College, especially the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, for hosting me and for supporting these lectures. It's great to be back in Boston. It's been a while since I've been here. When I finished my degree in 2009, I've gotten the chance to see old friends this weekend, this incredible fall weekend, and I've also had the chance to experience new places, especially this beautiful campus here at Boston College. Tonight's lecture is on early childhood in the comedy. Early childhood is not the first topic that comes to mind when one thinks of Dante's comedy. I wanted to begin by saying a few words about how I arrived at this topic and what I would like to accomplish this evening. Research topics often derive from previous projects. As scholars, we are constantly keeping our eyes peeled for new perspectives, new material, and new questions. This one was absolutely random. One day I simply had the urge to explore a new topic. I opened the list of sessions for the medieval conference held at Kalamazoo, and I found one that was entitled Adolescence and the Middle Ages. Through that research, I was introduced to the fascinating field of medieval childhood studies, and I realized that not much had been done with the comedy. In the end, I was initially interested in how Dante viewed children, but I slowly became more interested in how the poet employed children in his poem, and ultimately how children and childhood fit into his overall rhetorical strategy. In the last 50 years, the field of medieval childhood studies has thrived, often fueled by Philippe Ariès's controversial conclusion that childhood and adolescence as distinct stages in life did not exist during the Middle Ages. Ariès's study was extremely important because it was the first to examine medieval children as objects of historical investigation, but the problem was that his ideas often distorted medieval notions of children and helped propagate the caricature of medieval children perceived as miniature adults, which in fields outside medieval studies unfortunately still persists. Historians have subsequently shown that from the 12th century on, the late Middle Ages experienced favorable changes in how children and childhood were perceived. These socio-cultural transformations certainly influenced Dante, who, as we will see, viewed children and childhood positively. Recently, scholars of medieval childhood studies have urged that much more could be done with literary evidence than has been done to date. In the commentary tradition of the Commedia, scholars have noted the poet's genuine fondness for children, yet a comprehensive study of his approach has never been conducted. Dante's poem in this regard has much to offer. Although the poet's design consists almost exclusively of mature adults, aside from the presence of infant souls at the beginning of hell and at the end of paradise, children are far from absent in the poem. In one of the most memorable cantos, Inferno 33, we witness the heart-wrenching story of suffering told by Count Ugolino, who was imprisoned in a tower with 2 of his children and 2 of his grandchildren. Many commentators have noted that Dante depicted the children much younger than their actual ages in order to increase the pathos of their predicament. Moreover, this canto reveals another aspect of the poet's overall approach toward childhood, which is to utilize children's simplicity, innocence, and immaturity for rhetorical effect, almost always within the parent-offspring relationship. In Purgatorio 16, Marco Lombardo describes the creation of the human soul, portrayed as a child emerging from the hand of God. And this is Purgatorio 16, 85 to 90. Esce di mano a lui che la vagheggia, prima che sia a guisa di fanciulla, che piangendo e ridendo pargoleggia, l'anima semplicetta che s'annulla, salvo che mossa dal lieto fattore, volontier torna a ciò che la trastulla. From the hand of him who looks on it with love, before it lives, comes forth like a little girl, who weeps one moment and as quickly laughs, the simple infant soul that has no knowledge, but moved by a joyous maker, gladly turns to what delights it. The newborn soul is characterized as a young girl who willingly moves toward its maker as he plays with her in a tender scene between God and his creation that recalls the love and admiration a father displays before his reciprocating infant child. Lastly, at the end of Paradiso, where St. Bernard encourages Dante to explore the Empyrean and specifically Mary in her glory, more than 1,000 joyful angels, più di 1,000 angeli festanti, surround her while playing and singing. Such gaiety is not necessarily an explicit representation of childhood, but the angels' delightful frolicking expresses a childlike atmosphere around the mother of Christianity. It is here in the Empyrean where the pilgrim beholds the saved infant souls with their childlike faces and childlike voices, per li volti e anche per le voci puerili. While many commentators have concluded that in these verses Dante introduces a variety of ages for aesthetic and poetic reasons, these lines also exemplify the poet's aspiration to include more generally the sights and sounds of early childhood. Indeed, Dante incorporates children or images of childhood throughout the text by way of his characters' stories or through figurative descriptions as part of a broader rhetorical strategy that reflects the universal nature of the poem, implicating people of all ages. Nevertheless, images of children and childhood were not simply a repository of figures from which the poet could choose whenever necessary. Dante had a precise plan for children in his text. In fact, what has gone entirely unnoticed is the poet's systematic treatment of childhood that affects one of the most basic hermeneutic devices often employed in modern readings of Dante's poem, the distinction between Dante the pilgrim and Dante the poet. Central to my presentation will be the poet's notion of adolescenza, as expressed in Book 4 of the Convivio, where the poet divides human life into 4 ages. And it's also here, it's important to pay attention to how these terms are translated into English. Okay? Adolescenza, translated as youth, from birth to 25 years of age. Gioventute, maturity, from 25 to 45. Senectute, old age, from 45 to 70. And senio, extreme old age, from 70 to 80. Dante's scheme of life's ages as laid out in the Convivio supplies the poet with a developmental framework based on moral qualities that he then applies to the Commedia, specifically to the moral development of the pilgrim. Although the terms adolescenza and adolescente never appear explicitly in the Commedia, the idea of adolescenza extends to the entire poem. I will argue that the juvenilization of the main character is directly related to the poet's ages of man, namely the contrasting nature between adolescenza and gioventute, youth and maturity. Throughout the poem, often within the parent-offspring relationship, Dante applies figures of early childhood to his main character by associating the developmental qualities of adolescenza with the pilgrim, leaving the fully developed completion of gioventute for the narrator-author. From this perspective, Dante could have drawn from the developmental readings of the Aeneid by Fulgentius in the 6th century and Bernardo Silvestris in the 12th century, both of whom interpreted the main character of Aeneas through a process of maturation occurring horizontally across the structure of Virgil's text, from the infancy that characterizes Book 1 to the fully developed manhood of Book 6. Dante's rendering, however, is quite different, because he incorporates a developmental process of maturation that occurs vertically between the two personae inhabiting the main character, from the adolescenza of the inexperienced pilgrim to the gioventute of the experienced narrator-author. Although Dante inherently recognizes children's deficiencies, the poet will take advantage of them to foreground growth and maturation on various levels of the text, especially in his portrayal of the protagonist's spiritual development. Let's take a look at adolescenza from the Convivio to the Commedia. In Dante's moral characterization of adolescenza, he identifies 4 traits that are indispensable for a healthy development and passage into gioventute: obedience, obbedienza, gentleness, suavitate, bashfulness, vergogna, and physical beauty, adornezza corporale. And these are taken from Convivio 424, 425. The first 3 are inner qualities that allow a younger individual to be led by a more knowledgeable and experienced adult. The poet equates the adolescente to someone new to a city, and more significantly to a young person lost in the wood of life. E dunque da sapere che siccome quello che mai non fosse stato in una cittade non saprebbe tenere le vie senza insegnamento di colui che l'ha usata, così l'adolescente che entra nella selva erronea di questa vita non saprebbe tenere lo buono cammino, se dagli suoi maggiori non gli fosse mostrato, né lo mostrare varrebbe se agli loro comandamenti non fosse obbediente. E però fu a questa etade necessaria la obbedienza. It should be explained here that just as a stranger to a city would not know how to keep to the roads unless he received guidance from someone familiar with them, so the young person who enters the wood of this life with its maze of false paths would not be able to keep to the right one if it were not pointed out to him by his elders. However, their showing it to him would be quite useless if he were not obedient to their commands. That is why obedience has always been necessary for this stage." End quote. The unfamiliarity of the cityscape for a newcomer corresponds to the disorientation that an adolescente feels when entering the tortuous forest of this life. Such conditions call upon another person who can direct the newcomer or adolescente toward the right path. The intertextual connection between the selva erronea di questa vita, the wood of this life, with its maze of false paths, related to adolescenza, and the inferno's selva oscura, the dark wood, has been observed by many. However, the link between adolescenza and the pilgrim, at least to my knowledge, has never been explored. In the Commedia, through the implicit juxtaposition between adolescenza and gioventute, the author further demarcates the 2 voices of Dante present in the text: the vulnerable protagonist pilgrim, who will develop throughout the poem, and the sound narrator-author, who has already experienced the journey. This rendering occurs only on a figurative level, with the character embodying the qualities of an adolescente, and I quote, not in age but in spirit. Okay, and this is a translation from at the beginning of Convivio. In fact, in the Convivio, Dante utilizes puerizia, early childhood, precisely in this fashion. Puerizia non dico dettate, ma d'animo. Childishness, not in terms of age, but of mind. The pilgrim will therefore embody the qualities of an adolescente without actually being an adolescente. Yet the pilgrim, as Contini has laid bare, is also a poet whose spiritual safety is first entrusted to a famous sage, whom Dante declares his maestro and autore. This same pilgrim will eventually be greeted by other souls who speak of his poetry, who cite his canzoni, and some even consider him the initiator of a new style. He is a character who will be crowned by Virgil himself. Early in their trek, in the first circle of hell, the narrator places the pilgrim on the same level as Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, and Virgil, which is a demonstration of the character's intellectual and literary acumen through a gesture of self-importance. The author may just as well be exploiting his poem as a means of self-promotion, but more significantly, from a rhetorical perspective, he is also skillfully counterbalancing the weaker aspects of his character with this empowering image of intellectual prowess. Just as the main character must be distinguished from the narrator, two personae inhabit the protagonist, the poet and the sinner. The author of the text does not let the reader forget his character's intellectual and literary greatness, which, despite its import, necessarily yields to a more vulnerable Dante, the sinner. The neediness, the inadequacy, and the inexperience that the pilgrim sinner exhibits are all qualities inherently belonging to the disorientation of the developmental stages of human life. Thus, the poet, by conjuring his definition of adolescenza, will enhance the susceptible image of the pilgrim to make the character more realistic, more identifiable, and more believable along his road to conversion. At the beginning of the Commedia, Dante foregrounds the main character's bodily age by revealing it figuratively in the first verse of the text, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, midway in the journey of our life. Here and in the Convivio, the poet follows the Aristotelian paradigm in which a human life is divided into a triadic scheme of growth, augmentum, prime of life, status, and decay, decrementum, where midlife is understood as perfection in the sense of completion, and the preceding and subsequent ages as deficiency. The poet envisions a healthy human life of 70 years in terms of an arc that developed towards a peak, il punto colmo, and then descends into decay, with midlife culminating at 35 years of age. The pilgrim is thus a fully developed adult who has arrived at the highest point of gioventute, maturity, yet the character is presented as lost, fearful, and forceless, while Virgil emerges as the main character's more knowledgeable and experienced adult, someone who could help the pilgrim tenere lo buono cammino, keep to the right path. Dante's initial physical response to Virgil, con vergognosa fronte, literally with a bashful brow, demonstrates respect, but also the bashfulness, vergogna, that characterizes the adolescente. Even though the poet ultimately positions the protagonist to surpass Virgil, the character sinner is subjected to his guide henceforth. Dante's definition of gioventute in the Convivio accentuates the contrast between the two ages present in the Commedia. For gioventute, Dante lists 5 adjectives that are necessary for the full development of a human being: temperate, temperata, strong, forte, loving, amorosa, courteous, cortese, and loyal, leale. Out of these 5, temperance is the quality most essential to moral actions, and for Dante, Aeneas specifically exemplifies temperance and strength, which the author notes toward the end of this passage. And this is in the Convivio 426. E quanto raffrenare fu quello quando, avendo ricevuto da Dido tanto di piacere quanto di sotto, nel 7° trattato si dicerà. E usando con essa tanto di dilatazione, egli si partio per seguire onesta e laudabile via e fruttuosa, come nel 4° dell'Eneida scritto è. Quanto spronare fu quello quando esso Enea sostenette solo con Sibilla a entrare nello inferno a cercare dell'anima di suo padre Anchise, contra tanti pericoli come nel 6° della detta storia si dimostra, perché appare che nella nostra gioventute essere a nostra perfezione ne convegna temperati e forti. E questo fa e dimostra la buona natura, siccome lo testo dice espressamente. How Aeneas bridled himself when, after having received so much pleasure from Dido, and when experiencing so much delight with her, he tore himself away in order to follow an honorable, praiseworthy, and beneficial course. What a spurring onward occurred when the same Aeneas had the courage to go alone with the Sibyl down into hell in quest of the soul of his father Anchises, exposing himself to so many dangers. It is clear then that in our maturity, juventute, being perfect necessarily involves being temperate and strong. A good nature produces and displays these qualities, as the text expressly says. End quote. Temperance is illustrated through Aeneas's refusal to follow his sexual desires for the sake of grander ventures as the future founder of Rome, while strength is typified by the hero's courageous descent into hell. Both of these examples are overtly applicable and opposed to the pilgrim's condition because of his initial despair about beginning his journey and his intemperate amorous transgressions ultimately exposed by Beatrice in earthly paradise. What is striking in the Convivio is Dante's adoption of Aeneas as his model for all 5 of these qualities. Aeneas thus epitomizes for Dante the perfection that Joventute represents, and as a result, Inferno 2 acquires greater meaning, especially through the pilgrim's interjection, I am not Aeneas, nor am I Paul, where he recognizes his deficiency and inherent quality of adolescenza. Robert Hollander writes, it has frequently been remarked that this example of negative typology must be taken ironically. What the protagonist says is not what his author thinks. Dante is to be understood as both the new Aeneas and the new Paul. End quote. Nonetheless, the protagonist who has just begun his journey is still far from transforming into a new Aeneas. Only the narrator-author who has already completed his journey can be fully associated with Aeneas, and this is where the irony can be found in Inferno 232. To become the new Aeneas also means to display the qualities of Joventute, which Aeneas embodies and the pilgrim still lacks. Let's now move on to the parent-offspring relationship. The association between the pilgrim and adolescenza persists throughout the poem, determining our perception of the protagonist as he is treated as an adolescente by his guides, especially to the construct of the parent-offspring relationship. Although Dante hardly mentions his own parents, he envisions childhood through the lens of the parent-offspring relationship, which he incorporates into his conception of adolescenza. And this is Convivio 424. Onde, siccome nato tosto lo figlio alla tetta della madre s'apprende così tosto come alcuno lume d'animo in esso appare, si dee volgere alla correzione del padre e lo padre lui a maestrare. E guardisi che non l'idea di sé esempio nell'opera che sia contrario alle parole della correzione, che naturalmente vedemo ciascuno figlio più mirare alle vestigie degli paterni piedi che alle altre. Consequently, just as every child clings to his mother's breast as soon as he is born, so ought he to turn to his father for guidance as soon as the light of reason begins to dawn, and the father ought to offer him instruction. Furthermore, the father ought to ensure that the example of his conduct does not run counter to his words of instruction, for experience tells us that every child is spontaneously influenced more by the example of his father than that of others. End quote. It is essential, however, that the link between childhood and parent-offspring relations be contextualized because, generally speaking, these relations, which continue as time advances, do not restrict the offspring to childhood. The connection between childhood and parent-offspring relations is therefore a constructed association that more readily comes to mind precisely because parent-child relations are indispensable for proper human development. When we think of parents and their offspring, an 80-year-old and a 60-year-old do not readily come to mind, but there really is no reason why we should fail to make that connection. The more immediate, and I would say natural response, is to imagine the parent-offspring relationship when the child is still young and needful of parental support. But one has to admit that such connections are entirely subjective. What is important is that Dante views adolescenza through this blossoming relation, which resonates throughout the poem. On a very basic level of the Commedia, the pilgrim displays his inner qualities as an adolescente, demonstrating his obedience, gentleness, and bashfulness through his words and his demeanor, as we began to observe with Virgil in the last section. Moreover, the pilgrim's guides for his journey can be read analogically and figuratively as parental substitutes. As a result, Virgil frequently calls Dante his son, using the affectionate figliuolo, and in turn, Dante often refers to Virgil as his father. The poet even compares Virgil to a mother in their eventual escape from the Malebranche in Inferno 23. And these come from Inferno 23, verses 37 to 42. Lo duca mio di subito mi prese come la madre ch'al rumore è desta e vede presso a sé le fiamme accese, che prende il figlio e fugge e non s'arresta, avendo più di lui che di sé cura, tanto che solo una camicia vesta. My leader in a moment snatched me up like a mother who, awakened by the hubbub, before she sees the flames that burn right near her, snatches up her child and flees, and more concerned for him than for herself, does not delay to put a shirt on. By likening the pilgrim to a son who is apparently small enough to be transported by his mother, the poet supplies us with a powerful image of early childhood. This simile expresses the instinctive and unselfish reaction a mother has to defend her child's life against the prevalent medieval occurrence of house fires, which in this situation corresponds to the impending menace of the devil's encroachment. And with Dante clinging to Virgil's chest, the poet subsequently extends his simile by reiterating that his guide carried him come suo figlio, non come compagno, as if I were his child, not his companion. The narrator, as we will see, also treats Beatrice, regardless of Dante's amorous desires, as a maternal figure, with examples that often implicate early childhood. However, before the poet draws on figures evoking images of nurturing and tenderness, empowering his character takes precedence. In earthly paradise, once the pilgrim realizes that the woman before him is Beatrice, he searches for the already departed Virgil, running for him like a fantolin, a young boy, runs to his mamma. While Dante surprises us at times with his feminine imagery to expose the protective side of Virgil, the poet initially adopts a masculine representation of Beatrice to have her project an assertive demeanor. Quasi ammiraglio che in poppa in prora viene a veder la gente che ministra, just like an admiral who moves from stern to prow to see the men that serve. Though this woman appears to be the same Beatrice from the poet's past, she now displays a domineering attitude toward the whimpering pilgrim who cowers and cries without his Virgil. She is the decisive adult in charge, and the narrator portrays her as such. Her superior posturing reflects the full-fledged security and confidence of the developed age of gioventute to which Beatrice belongs. In fact, she says, "In sulla soglia fui di mia seconda etate." Once I reached the threshold of my second age. Purgatory 30, verses 124 to 125. The contrast between adolescenza, youth, and gioventute, maturity, could not be any more apparent than in Dante's Edenic encounter with Beatrice, intensified by how the poet reinvents his beloved as he moves from the Vita Nuova to the Commedia. In the Vita Nuova, Dante firmly establishes his love for Beatrice in their childhood years by situating their first encounter during the age of puerizia, early childhood. But what stands out is how the poet associates even an older Beatrice with early childhood in two impressionable moments of the text, in a vision at the beginning and toward a fantasy toward the end. In the first instance, after recounting the genesis of his love for Beatrice at 9 years of age, the poet advances the narration 9 years later, where he recalls Beatrice's first greeting. While thinking about her, Dante gently falls asleep, where he is overtaken by a marvelous vision in which a lord, love personified, appears holding a person, Beatrice, who is unclothed, asleep, and wrapped in a cloth. In the vision, the Lord awakens Beatrice, who is force-fed Dante's heart, which she eats hesitatingly. Behind this imagery sits a superimposed representation of a sleeping child in an adult's arms, nelle sue braccia, who, once awakened, appears light enough to be secured with one hand, nell'una delle mani, and fed with the other, le facea mangiare. In this illustration of portability, common to early childhood, this image of a portable Beatrice opposes the 18-year-old she actually was at the time. Simply from the perspective of childhood, it is worth noting how the poet infantilizes Beatrice through this vision. Even more significant, toward the end of the text, an already deceased Beatrice appears in a fantasy of Dante's where he continues to associate his beloved with the imagery of their first encounter when she was 9 years old. Mi parve vedere questa gloriosa Beatrice con quelle vestimenta sanguigne con le quali apparve prima agli occhi mie e pareami giovane in simile etade in quale prima la vidi. I seemed to see this glorious Beatrice with those crimson vestments in which she first appeared before my eyes. Dante's love for Beatrice, while she was alive, endured approximately 16 years. Yet the pilgrim's first reaction to her presence in the Commedia is to recall their first encounter while underscoring his age at the time. And this is Purgatory 30, verses 40 to 42. Tosto che nella vista mi percosse l'alta virtù che già mi aveva trafitto prima che io fuor di puerizia fosse. As soon as that majestic force, which had already pierced me once before I had outgrown my childhood, struck my eyes. With the pilgrim still reliving his past, Beatrice emotionally jolts him with her arresting commands, first by ordering him to stop crying, and then to look at her directly. Being the sinner that he is, Beatrice then questions the poet's ascent of Mount Purgatory. The pilgrim responds as he did to Virgil, obedient, gentle, and bashful. The poet uses vergogna, bashfulness, and fronte, brow, practically the same words employed in the first encounter with Virgil in Inferno 1, with a bashful brow. The narrator then compares Beatrice to a mother, adopting a simile that enhances the pilgrim's perspective, who fails to understand Beatrice's harsh pity as tough love. Così la madre al figlio par superba, com'ella parve a me, perché d'amaro sente il sapor della pietade acerba. As a mother may seem overbearing to her child, she seemed to me, for the taste of such stern pity is a bitter taste. The frustration captured in this figure is a timeless sensation of early childhood that shows how acutely observant Dante was of a child's limited understanding from an emotional and cognitive standpoint. Dante's choice of superbo, haughty or arrogant, reveals the subtlety of his expression in this verse. Superbo, being a moral term of judgment incomprehensible to a child, is here better served in its etymological connotation, meaning superiority, in this hierarchical snapshot as we envision a child in all his vulnerability peering upward to his imposing parent. After Dante's brief confession in Purgatorio 31, Beatrice continues to elaborate on his past transgressions through an extended avian metaphor that includes images of youth to express figuratively the pilgrim's immaturity. This is Purgatory 31, verses 58 to 63. Non ti dovea gravar le penne in giuso ad aspettar più colpo o pargoletta o altra novità con sì breve uso. Novo augelletto 2 o 3 aspetta, ma dinanzi dagli occhi dei pennuti rete si spiega indarno o si saetta. You should not have allowed your wings to droop, leaving you to other darts from some young girl or other novelty of such brief use. The fledgling may allow even a third attempt, but all in vain is the net flung or arrow shot in sight of a full-fledged bird. Beatrice compares Dante to a young bird which, as it takes to the air, would rather fly downward toward earth as opposed to upward toward the heavens, unaware of the higher probability of being ensnared. In these verses, an evident contrast exists between the fledgling, an immature child, and the full-fledged birds, the experienced adults. While a fledgling allows 2 or 3 attempts against it, hunters have little chance facing a full-fledged adult bird. Beatrice's scolding also incriminates Dante's youthful interest in a pargoletta, a young girl, another term connoting early childhood. Given the reference's ambiguity, however one interprets it, Beatrice emphasizes something or someone unbecoming of Dante's age, which is at the center of her rebuke. Beatrice criticizes Dante's immaturity, and ironically, he behaves in a childlike way, since the narrator approximates his reaction to the silent shame expressed by sorrowful children who recognize their own guilt. And this is Purgatory 31, 64 to 69. Quali fanciulli vergognando muti con gli occhi a terra stannosi, ascoltando e sé riconoscendo e ripentuti, tal mi sta vio. Ed ella disse, quando per udir sei dolente, alza la barba e prenderai più doglia riguardando. As children in their shame stand mute, their eyes upon the ground, listening, acknowledging their fault, repentant, just so I stood. And then she said, now that you are grieved by what you hear, lift up your beard, and you shall have more grief from what you see. Nowhere more than here, the poet stresses the disparity between the pilgrim's inner child, contrasted with his physical appearance, reflecting his actual age. And Beatrice appears annoyed by this stark difference when she commands Dante to lift up his barba, his beard. In this context, it matters little whether the beard is metaphorical or literal. The reference points to his physical maturity in the here and now. The pilgrim understands the harshness of her critique, especially because it sternly reminds him of his present disgraceful condition. This proves to be the last time that Dante is characterized as a child in the Purgatorio. By the end of this canticle, he is spiritually reborn, which is reiterated in the last verses. In this garden where Adam and Eve lost their innocence, Dante regains his, and in a sense, he returns to a spiritual state akin to the innocence of his own childhood. In the Paradiso, however, the poet does not refrain from comparing the pilgrim to children, because as the pilgrim progresses, the character's insufficiency endures in yet another unfamiliar domain. From the beginning of Paradise, Beatrice evidences Dante's childish thoughts by highlighting the poet's intellectual sluggishness at grasping more difficult concepts during their ascent. While Dante's similes concerning children become sparser throughout the canticle, the poet applies figures of early childhood to the pilgrim as far as Paradiso 22. In the sphere of Saturn, where complete silence reigns, Dante and Beatrice meet with Peter Damian, who at the end of Paradiso 21 criticized the abuses of contemporary clerics, after which the souls surrounding Damian produce a cry so loud that nothing here could be compared to it. This cry explains Dante's wonder and subsequent fear at the beginning of Paradiso 22. And this is at the beginning of Paradiso 22. Oppresso di stupore alla mia guida mi volsi come parvol che ricorre sempre colà dove più si confida. E quella come madre che soccorre subito al figlio pallido e anelo con la sua voce che il suol ben disporre. Overcome by wonder, I turn to my guide as does a child who always scurries back to the one who has his utmost trust, and she like a mother, quick in comforting her son when he is pale and out of breath, with a voice that has often calmed him in the past. In this double simile, Dante insightfully illustrates in equal measure both sides of the parent-offspring relationship. Oppressed by the wonder of such a sonic explosion, Dante turns to Beatrice as a child appeals to the one parent he trusts most, and thus the poet portrays the classic immediate decision that children instinctively make in moments of fear. At the same time, Beatrice, like a mother, relieves the youngster with the one natural instrument to which a mother resorts to soothe her sickly child, her voice, che il suol ben disporre, that has often calmed him in the past. The pilgrim's reaction reveals his continuous insecurities as he expects disapproval even this far in paradise. By characterizing Dante as a child, the poet accentuates the differences between the experienced heavenly soul and the inexperienced live human being. These differences, however, continue to be expressed through a parent-child framework until the very end of the Commedia, where St. Bernard is immediately introduced as a tenero padre, loving father. The saint, in turn, refers to Dante as figliuol di grazia, child of grace, an added qualification that removes Dante from being a metaphorical child of the saints to a child of God who is the only donor of grace. Throughout the poem, it is the narrator who figuratively portrays the pilgrim as a child in order to express the character's inadequacies, which he alone bears, because the pilgrim's experience, although identifiably universal, is still particular and personal. But when we arrive at the end of the journey, when the pilgrim is before God, his deficiency is ours as well, because his unique presence in the Empyrean typifies the universal opposition between the finite and the infinite through the impossibility of comprehending and expressing an omnipotent being. The last simile of the text, dealing with adolescenza, is the only one in the poem applied to the narrator himself, who with his limited capacity to remember struggles to articulate God, like an infant child who has arrived at the stage of speech but lacks the language to communicate successfully. And this is Paradise 33, verses 106 to 108. O mai sarà corta mia favella, purca quel ch'io ricordo che d'un fante che bagna ancora la lingua alla mammella. Now my words will come far short of what I still remember, like a babe's who at his mother's breast still wets his tongue. In this simile of ineffability can be found the narrator's deficiency, which has nothing to do with his age or immaturity, but the inherent insufficiency all humans share before their God. In this sense, Dante also suggestively reminds us of how all humans in our common deficiency participate in the greater heavenly family as children of God. In conclusion, for Dante, children grow out of their innocence and into a life filled with temptation. Hence, the poet understood young children as individuals that were inherently separate from the world of adults. Beatrice echoes this sentiment after St. Peter's denunciation of contemporary church leadership when she says, and this is Paradiso 27, verses 127 to 129, Fede e innocenza son reperte solo nei parvoletti, poi ciascuna pria fugge che le guance sia coperte. Loyalty and innocence are found in little children only. Then before their cheeks are bearded, both are fled. She then provides two examples that show the transitioning from innocence to sinfulness. One child fasts when required, but once mature, he devours food uncontrollably. The other child loves and listens to his mother, but once mature, he hopes for her death. In these verses, the poet foregrounds childhood innocence to illustrate the perversion of the will that occurs naturally in all humans when left unbridled. It is here where the poet reconnects the child's condition to the world of adults, because a child's need for parents prefigures and mirrors an adult's necessity for civic and spiritual guidance. At the same time, childhood innocence provides the poet with emotions, images, and connections that enhance the poet's palette by counterbalancing the harsh world of adults. Nowhere in the poem are children portrayed negatively. Dante, who understood that childhood was a special stage of life distinct from adulthood, took advantage of children's inherent limitations, but their deficiency is never an obstacle to their goodness. Dante was interested in children's simplicity, as I noted at the beginning, where the poet in Purgatorio 16 theorizes the necessity for guidance through the image of the newborn soul. The parent-child relationship is the most basic social bond that is echoed elsewhere in the text, from the societal between the Pope and his followers, or the emperor and his subjects, to the metaphysical between God and his creation. In this context, we must not exclude the textual affiliation between the poet and his readers. Erich Auerbach emphasized the didactic nature of the authorial interventions with a poet-prophet who surpasses his readers because he possesses a revelation of great importance that they must learn from him. As the pilgrim requires continuous assistance, the narrator-author maintains a position to guide, provide, and reveal. While parallels can be made between the pilgrim as an adolescente toward his guides, the narrator associated with the perfection and full development of Gioventute functions through his poetic creation as a spiritual guide for all readers, especially those who can identify with the deficiencies embodied by the pilgrim. As a result, the pilgrim can be considered a figure of the reader, and the text is transformed into a vehicle for spiritual maturation. Thank you. Thank you.
So, let's open the floor.
Would it be fair to sum up your basic argument as Dante, the pilgrim, is a child growing to understanding and maturity. Virgil and Beatrice are his parents. And on the other hand, we are children, and Dante, the pilgrim, is our parent.
Exactly.
Leading us.
Yeah. In a sense, I think that's how it can work, and that's what I was suggesting. So in a sense, there's this. It allows for a space for growth, and again, it works at a figurative level. It's clearly that Dante is clearly not a child, but yet it allows for that space because we note the difference between Dante the pilgrim and Dante the narrator. The voice changes. I mean, the voice is that controlling voice that guides, that guiding voice, and that's a different type of guide. I mean, a guide that's a poetic guide in a sense for the reader. Does that?
Can I add something?
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps we've got the image of the angels at play as an idea of us coming full circle, that the end of growth and maturity is to return to the innocence and love of the child.
Well, that's also an interesting point. I don't really mention this, but it's sort of problematic that Dante portrays the saved children as children, because according to Peter Lombard and Aquinas, at the Last Judgment, we would actually, even if we died as children, we would actually sort of spiritually develop and appear as if we were in mid-age, because that is considered a completed soul, a completed spirit, completed soul. And Dante specifically says that they appear to us as they would have during the Last Judgment. So it is kind of interesting that he did portray them as children and not, he does do this also for poetic reasons too. I mean, it does allow for more diversity in that sense. It allows for children also to enter the poem.
There's something very reminiscent of that in the English poem *The Pearl*, where the 2-year-old, the child who dies at 2, appears to her father as an adult woman, instructing him.
Thank you.
I was thinking about Beatrice versus Virgil, and we always think of the first encounter
Uh-huh.
And yet, and that seems very significant that he encountered this woman, this spirit, when he was an innocent child.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, clearly, Virgil is an encounter that he made as with a much more mature mind, as at a very different phase in his development. I never really thought about those encounters that we always think of as Dante's biography for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's tradition to do so, but they may have nothing to do with Dante's biography. They may have to do with his moral biography.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, and also another thing to think about is that these are not the only characters in which Dante has this sort of father-son relationship. I mean, Robert Holland talks about the program of the fathers, and we find that elsewhere, especially Brunetto, for example, where we find Dante has a sort of father-son relationship, and this I believe only adds to it. The reason why I concentrated on the guides is because it's sort of at a fundamental level of the text. I mean, the guides are clearly higher up on the. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm having a little bit of difficulty understanding the medieval conception of adolescenza
Mm-hmm.
from 0 to 20.
Yeah. Yes. So there were various types of ages of man, and it's interesting that, and there's the whole issue even in the Convivio, does Dante include puerizia in adolescenza or not? In Franca Brambilla Ageno's edition, she believes that he doesn't include it, but in a newer edition by Gianfranco Fioravante in the Meridiani edition, he does. I mean, I believe that Dante did not sort of forget puerizia. I mean, it wasn't. He sort of gets presented as a second thought. What I'm also trying to do is emphasize that Dante wasn't just interested, I mean, in this notion of adolescenza. What stands out is puerizia is what really stands out. So puerizia is, I mean, something very close to Dante, more so than what we call adolescence. I mean, there aren't many, we don't really know who's adolescent but there is, I think one of the only mentionings of an adolescent is actually Jesus as a 13-year-old in, I believe, Purgatory. There's there's a one moment. Yes, exactly, where Mary couldn't find Jesus when he was 13-year-old, and he was in the temple. So yeah, it is kind of, and it's also, even the translation shows you how difficult it is in terms of a concept. We have to, translate a word like gioventute, which is normally translated as youth, as maturity. We're sort of forced to do that.
What's the
And
history of the word? I mean, how come
adolescenza, Gioventute, Juventus meaning young, but I believe that it sort of gets applied to sort of a later time in one's life. I think in Latin terms, it's just the way that they use the term, I believe, and how it changes over time. That's the only thing, but it comes from the word youth, even though it's sort of applied differently when they start studying or at least defining and dividing human life into ages. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, this passage from the Convivio that you bring to our attention, where he talks about the child who first clings to his mother's breast and then comes under his father's instruction. And that, of course, is really what happens in the comedy, only it is Virgil who's the mother, and Beatrice is the instructing father, Virgil the comforting, nourishing parent.
That is true. That is interesting.
So the fact that he does characterize them in those kind of inverted and surprising ways is really in keeping with that whole concept of pedagogy that is already present in the Commedia, but has this rather complete transformation and rebirth into something very different in the So it's very, very interesting.
Oh, good, thanks.
Yeah, my question, I mean, I don't even know if it's a question, but it's kind of related to something that's, I mean, I was really interested in this relationship in a way. These convivial passages, I mean, the whole bit, the Aeneid, like the paradigm of Aeneas, which is, in your argument, if I understood it, it's kind of linked with Juventude, so maturity there. But I also find it interesting if you think of really the Vita Nuova as being a puerizia text in a way, and that's how it's reappropriated then in Earthly Paradise.
Yeah, he even said, he says that, he actually says that
it's
in the
really
Convivio.
interesting because in the context of the Aeneas like paradigm and Convivio, of course, what he's rejecting is Vita Nuova there, right? The fervida e passionata is the period of Vita Nuova that now he's trying to leave behind because he's trying to establish his moral authority. But I just find it really interesting. I wondered whether you could construct, I mean, do you think, I want to know what you think, does pueritia in the end also become bound up in a sense in his reclaiming also in a sense what becomes like the lyric part of the epic Commedia? And I say that because I was also struck, it's maybe the one example, I'm sure you've written about it in your article, but you know that moment where the pilgrim has to go through the wall of fire, and Virgil in the end, he tries all his reasoning, like his recourse to reason, and the pilgrim will not move, and then he mentions Beatrice, like the apple in front of the child, and the pilgrim walks, and I mean, Christian Maids writes that beautiful gloss of that moment, saying that's really where you understand that that moment, the passage, is like an event of love. It's not reason that conquers fear, that it's love. And I just wonder, because that really seems to be where puerizia is also being established as this kind of incredible, the child has that capacity, maybe you see it also in the anima semplicetta, to love. So I just wondered, is that part of, in a sense, how puerizia also becomes then even into Paradiso, that moment when the souls in Paradiso 23 look up to Mary, reaching up like infants for the breast. And I mean, it's what, you know, Chestaro's also written, The Triumph of the Resurrected Breast. I mean, that becomes, in a sense, the model for the experience of the divine. I just wondered, do you think we
I
can
haven't,
make that?
I haven't completely thought of it in these terms, and also this sort of argument came out of like a larger project. Because once I started reading all these texts, especially about medieval childhood studies, you can really get lost. And I think various versions of this paper sort of got kind of jumbled along the way. And this was sort of the argument that I just sort of that came out that I think was the most compact and made I think at least the most sense out of some of the other things that I was exploring. But I haven't looked at it particularly that way, but it's something I'll definitely think about. But there is something interesting about, as even I think from a theological point of view, and I mean, like as you mentioned this, how the l'anima semplicetta, just literally it's that natural. There's a natural movement towards the Creator that is love. I mean, that is a natural sort of. So that's, yeah. I mean,
and it's also, I guess, the linguistic paradigm, because I mean the other, the torso fila la testa della madre. I mean that's the movement away from the wet nurse towards the I'm estranito del padre, but it's also like entry into the language, like and then the symbolic and everything else you want to say. But it's interesting that then if you also think of the linguistic paradigm of the Commedia being something like the Summa Humilis, also of the Bible, that's also like in a sense the babble of the infant, right, and the ability for language to incorporate that non-rash, I mean also the kind of most humble in Auerbach's reading of the Summa Humilis. I find it's really interesting, you can see it all kind of connecting up again.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing is, it's also interesting how it's clear that Dante has an incredible love for children, but even just the way that, I mean, I think this sort of allows us to at least give us an idea of what he thought of children. And when you read, especially the medieval childhood studies, it's you would, if you wouldn't sort of look at Dante from this perspective, or just sort of read texts about what perceptions are of children during the Middle Ages, you would think that children, they hated them, and they were yeah. I mean, it's just here we just don't see that at all. I mean, at all. I mean, and especially if you see how a lot of times they quote Augustine. Who, I mean, for Augustine, I mean, children were satanic. I mean, they had the devil in them. Yeah. Yes. That came out, I believe, in 67, I believe. Let me just, no, earlier, 62. In 62. And it's I really tried not to mention it, only because every single piece of research that deals with medieval childhood studies mentions it. Whether most are against this notion, and there are some who defend it. But I mean, in the end, I mean, he had an incredible influence on the field. So I mean, that's, I think, definitely something that needs to be mentioned. But it is amazing if you look at some of the, I mean, I've seen books outside, even like a handbook of romanticism that recently came out, and they have this idea of medieval childhood that, it just seems very distorted.
In the early feminist movement, you read some texts where they talk about reintroduction of the abolition of childhood. I was wondering where this idea came from. Obvious area.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there were a lot of sort of, I guess during the 60s, there was this idea of recuperating parts of history that had never really been studied before, or at least given such, an importance.
I have a question about the image of Beatrice
Mhm.
in the Vita Nova.
Mhm.
I didn't understand, you said infantilization. For me, I didn't quite understand the point you were making. I'm sorry, and maybe you can explain it again.
I was just trying to, for me, we see a contrast between Dante, the adolescente, and Beatrice, who clearly takes on this sort of adult, for some reason, in the Vita Nuova, we have a different, and this also creates a contrast between Beatrice of the Vita Nuova and Beatrice of the Divine Comedy. And I just found it interesting that for some reason he sort of almost purposely infantilizes her through this image, simply through the imagery.
I'm not sure if I see infantilization. She's made this passive sufferer. She's a sufferer, but God can easily hold a woman in one hand. But Lord, that love is a God.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I don't see her.
No, what I'm saying is as I said, I said it was a superimposed image. So this image, I mean, Dante for me as like a sort of a model for this image of a sort of small, because clearly she's small, right? God doesn't have any size. So here we have, this love, this personified character holding Beatrice in one arm and feeding her in the other. I sort of saw that as an adult and a child, especially because I emphasize at various moments this idea of portability. Because even when Dante is being held by Virgil, again, it's how many adults have you carried along? I mean, so clearly portability is something we I think more naturally associate with a child being carried. And that was the only sort of, as I said, it's a superimposed image. Again, it's I just found it interesting. And again, it has to do with these contrasts between Beatrice of the Vita Nuova, Beatrice, and how she would, like that would, I don't think Dante would ever use that type of imagery in the Divine Comedy to describe Beatrice. It would take away from her character. But yet there at the beginning we have this, and again it sort of fits into this emphasis on purizia at the beginning of the text.
Well, I mean, in the very last, or almost the last sonnet that he writes, he says, begins it saying, I've been with love since the circulation of my ninth son.
Yeah, exactly. There's this constant
always
return
going back
to that
infantile moment.
Yes, and that's what and exactly that's what I was trying to emphasize. But that's again, it's different, in especially in the creation of a character. That's what I was, I think, looking at. Did I answer your question, or?
I see it more like Woody Allen's Mother in the Sky.
But it is also really, I mean, that point that he's also somehow conflating Eros with Purizia. I mean, that's what's really
Mhm.
fascinating too, right? Because,
It's a very dangerous.
I mean, no, but that's what he, I mean, that's the incredible thing about the Commedia, that she can be mother and lover, and I mean, that's the,
Mm-hmm.
the sense of Beatrice can be both those things. So it's fascinating.
I want to say the image of the Beatrice as a child is not just a portability on the one hand, but it's also on the other hand a feeding.
Exactly, it's the le faceva mangiare. I mean, as if.
You almost have the portability, but the other one is just.
Exactly, that's what I was also emphasizing. But you didn't see that. I mean,
Yeah,
you didn't. No, but you didn't see that as being sort of, an,
I never thought about that.
Oh, okay.
Never felt that, and I'll have to think of some more before.
okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I'm glad you haven't thought. I hope I brought a different perspective.
I'll take them on then. Well, this was a very, very rich talk. It's the first
Well, I
time
hope I
we've
give-
ever had a really a discussion of the Commedia from a certain perspective. We haven't done this before. But
Oh,
you
good. I
set
hope.
a wonderful precedent.
Good. I hope
We
that.
thank you,
I hope you enjoyed it.
very much. That's all.
Thank you.